Hello, 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 everybody. I hope that you are doing amazingly this evening, this afternoon, this morning, wherever you are calling in from. Welcome to the African Climate Alliance ACA dialogue. So, the ACA dialogue. Today, we'll be talking about empowering change, strategies for transforming systems in the face of the climate crisis. And I'm not alone. I'm joined, as Kulu mentioned, the dream team. I'm joined by Kulu. Kulu, do you want to just pop in and say, hey?
Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be a very exciting one. I'm so excited already.
Awesome. Thanks, Tolu. So yeah, my name is Gabriel. This is Tolu from the African Climate Alliance, and we will be your facilitators, space holders for today. This month's theme is navigating changing systems in a changing climate. On Monday, the 21st, no, 24th, Monday, the 24th of June, we had our lovely Back to Basics workshop where we kind of took us back to the basics of the topic. And we began to understand the systemic roots of the climate crisis. We started looking at colonialism and what that looked like and the impacts that it currently still has on people, the environment, on Africa. And we looked at it through like that Afrocentric lens that we really believe, our work as African Climate Alliance is to kind of highlight. We also went into depth on the topic of capitalism because you cannot have the conversation with one without the other. At the end of the day, these things are intertwined. The roots go deep, but our roots of resistance and resilience goes deeper. And so that conversation really began to prime us to understand what is capitalism, what is colonialism, and how are these systems of oppression feeding into currently, where we find ourselves right now. And today, like I mentioned, we are diving into a conversation with two amazing practitioners, people who find themselves in the middle ground of practice and theory and really believing in kind of taking the bull by the horn, so to speak. Um, and kind of guiding in many different spheres in their own circles and lives, and hopefully today in ours, kind of understanding how we can begin to look at strategies for transforming systems in the face of the climate crisis. And so I will share my screen and just begin to show a little bit about who we are speaking to today. Because I can't keep you on the edge of your seat forever. I mean, I wish I could, but not right now. Um, so awesome. Today, for our discussion, one of our amazing panelists will be Joe Kobuthi, and Joe is from Kenya, is a scholar and an advocate, holds a dual master's degree in philosophy and public policy with a career marked by intellectual rigor and advocacy. Joe has served as a senior editor of The Elephant, a prestigious Pan-African magazine, for 8 years. 8 years, guys. Throughout this tenure, he has demonstrated a steadfast commitment to amplifying critical African voices on issues of governance. Kubuti's extensive body of work it encompasses profound explorations into the philosophical underpinnings of public policy and the ethical dimensions of governance. We'll begin to understand what these look like and what these mean, and how they show up in our daily lives. Through conversation with Joe, no doubt, he's widely recognized for his insightful analysis and thought-provoking contributions to the discourse on decolonial. You see, the word colony throws up. This is why we had the conversation on Monday. Decolonial theory and practice. He has been a prominent speaker at numerous forums where he passionately engages audiences in conversations that challenge prevailing narratives and advocate for equitable global framework. So a massive, massive, massive welcome to you, Joan. We'll hear from you in a moment because even though I've read your bio, sometimes truly understanding who you are must come from you. Um, and so, uh, in addition to Joe, today we've got Abednego Chanda from Zambia. They are a member of Zambia Youth Federation and is spearheading the Know Your City TV program in Zambia under Slum Dwellers International SDI. He's a social change advocate, a photographer, a videographer trained by the Slum Dwellers International Know Your City team. Um, These skills have allowed him to play a role in helping to amplify the voice of community through audio visual means, harnessing the power of media and using it to promote change. Abednego uses his media skills to document challenges, community-led processes, and locally led solutions to informal settlements in Zambia. If I'm not mistaken, I may be horribly, horribly, horribly mistaken, but I believe I've met Abednego in person once. I might be mistaken, but I do believe I have. But welcome, welcome, welcome. Um, but yeah, I think I've read these bios, these amazing bios, and we've gone through this and we've gone through that. But are we truly in the know of who we are speaking to if we have not heard from them? So I would like to prompt the very first question of tonight's panel, knowing that we will have opportunity for some questions from you also, as we're hearing these amazing practitioners begin to kind of unpack a bit more about who they are, about how they work. Think about your questions, pop them in the chat. Thu will be compiling those questions. When it comes to a bit of a Q&A, we will dive into it. But yeah, maybe I can start with you, Joe. Could you tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing?
Okay, so as I said, moving through campus and you realizing the contradictions within your own society. So I think this led me through a journey. First, going to public policy, seeing the limitations of public policy, in particular because public policy as how it's framed, not just in Kenya and in Africa in many schools, but public policy assumes a reform agenda. So what do I mean by this? It assumes that the assumptions of the state or the assumptions of society work, but all you need to do is to tweak them around, and that tweaking is what now will fix the space. So I think this now moved me from traditional public policy think tanking stuff to now a philosophical and theological work, which is where I'm in. And this is when I said now engaging rigorously as a as a writer, but also even as a as a as a as an academic with the works of decolonial scholars. Of course, more contemporary people like Walter Mignolo and other decolonial schools, but going further back, in particular the works of Franz Fanon, and really putting me squarely in Fanonian thought and reading his work and trying to contextualize where the world is based on how empire was created. And this is not become this will become my major work. So and just when I conclude my initial remarks and looking at particularly Fanon works and the colonial thinking led me to the journey of looking at how modernity was formulated, from 1492 coming all the way to present days, looking at the pillars of modernity. So for a long time, my assumption was the problem with Africa was a philosophical mindset, right? So that's why I did philosophy at my postgrad. One of them, looking at thinking that if we just imbibe a certain level of critical awareness, critical consciousness, people will be fine. But studying modernity and how Western modernity in particular was formed, to realize that the two pillars that hold it together are theological and psychological. Theological to the extent that whiteness or European thought designed a world where they made themselves. They used theology first to conquer the world, and then they replaced theology, in this case Christianity. So, that's the one pillar that holds Western modernity. The other pillar is psychological. So every time after they did the civilizing mission and stuff like that, the next thing I did was that there was a psychological imperative imbued within global systems that holds these two twin things together. And of course, undergirded by other things altogether, patriarchy, etc., many other things. But these two disciplines hold Western modernity. So, and with that is the reason why after the last couple of years, 3-4 years, of course, having a philosophical and public policy imperative, have significantly moved to more theological and psychological work even and to the extent that even looking at, for instance, food systems. I've been extensively at Elephant around food systems, how sort of studying everything on Kenya. For instance, a book by Chloe Campbell called Eugenics in Kenya, how race and eugenics in Kenya, how, for instance, how race and eugenics was used to classify what foods were good for the native and what foods were not good for the native. So in that regard, you realize how the underpinning of our system, even our current climate crisis, of course, it comes from a larger historical trajectory of capitalism, but it's imbued with these two frameworks: a theological framework, which is what we call Western Christianity, and a psychological. So the two things that hold modernity together. So I think those are just random thoughts. Just before we go to our conversation.
For random thoughts, they seem pretty well thought out, I must say. Um, so yeah, thank you for diving into that. And I think Tulu will maybe chat to you privately just about audio stuff. But what I really appreciated hearing coming out of your conversation was how you started in one point and you found that actually it takes more than just one avenue or one pillar of approach. I think it really does highlight the fact that in the fight against the climate crisis, in the fight against any issue, social issue, economic issue, we can't have one track thinking. We don't live one issue lives, and so we can't have one issue solutions. And so um, I love the point that you said about contextualizing the approach, steering the narrative to fit what's needed in that moment, looking at the different avenues, whether it be the political reform that you speak of, whether it be the narrative transformation that you speak of, the political awareness, or even deeper than that, going to that bottom point, going to the deep-seated thought rather than I think I might have been mistaken in hearing, and we'll hear a bit more later, but how you've approached the point of you thought it was just political awareness that was needed or this or that was needed, but actually you found out, no, it's something more, it's something deeper, and that approach needs the attention that it deserves. So massive thanks for that, Joe, and I'm looking forward to diving into deeper conversation in a little bit. In the interim, Abednego, maybe I could ask you the same question. Could you please tell us a bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing? And maybe after that, we will start a question with you, is your understanding of the systems that underpin the climate crisis. But yeah, the first point being, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you got into the work that you're doing.
Hi, everybody. Am I audible enough?
Yes, you are.
Okay. Yeah, we have road shading in Zambia, and where I am is pretty dark. That's why I'm unable to just turn on my camera. But okay, so my name is Abednego Chanda, but I'm well known as Mark Tavish because of me being an artist. So I'm a filmmaker, a documentary filmmaker to be specific. So I love telling stories from the informal settlement and just how people live. So usually my work is driven by the passion I have for young people and for the way people are living in the informal settlements. And that's how I got to find myself in the climate space, because a number of issues that affect young people, and they don't have platforms where they can express and amplify their voices with impacts that they face. And that's how I got to see that media has certain power. And through my documentary filmmaking, I'm able to amplify the voices of people living in marginalized communities, and we are able to reach quite a huge number of stakeholders and government bodies. So through my filmmaking, we have been able to influence policies that affect quite a number of people they had to reach, and That's why out of everything that I've done, I just discovered that we're in the climate space and looking at the drought situation in our country, I got to learn that through my filmmaking, I'm able to just speak on behalf of people who cannot speak for themselves, and certain people who cannot advocate, because majority of the time people in informal settlements are left out in decision making, are left out in roundtable discussions. But through the skills and talents that I have gotten to develop in my filmmaking, I am able to just advocate for them and just speak on their behalf. Yeah, I think that's about me.
Thanks so much for that. And I love the approach that we're taking here today, guys. I think we've got a discussion to note. I'm telling you now, watch the space as we dive into conversation this evening. Because I mean, even the way that you started with, well, many might know me as Mark, because like I'm like, an artist name coming forth. And I think, I mean, I get very passionate about this because I think a lot of what we talk about at ACA is how do we approach different mediums. And we saw Joe speak about a little bit, the different ways to engage change and to look at change making. And we're hearing from you, how you use your activism, how you use your art, how you use your creativity and your skills to elevate the voices of the marginalized, to highlight the stories on the ground, and to help bring those who are left in the kind of rear, or in the marginalized space, in the back, and kind of put them forward and kind of elevate their voices to a place that they have not been before. Um, I mean, I think we begin to start seeing this conversation really emerge a bit deeper, and maybe a bit, Nico, maybe while you still have the mic, I'd like to ask you the following question, and you've begun to answer it somewhat, is in your understanding, what are the systems that underpin the climate crisis? And acknowledging the climate crisis isn't just this thing that is the environment, but it's affecting people. It's beginning to look at that. And so I mean, we're starting to see, and we've heard a little bit about it, voices being left out of the space, voices being marginalized, voices being oppressed, people being impacted, the environment being impacted. And so my question to you is, what in your understanding are the systems that are underpinning the climate crisis and leaving us where we are at the moment?
Thank you so much. I'll just first start with giving a practical example of what happened last year. I had an opportunity of being at COP28 in Dubai, and I did a documentary with some of my friends on why people in marginalized communities don't advocate about climate change, don't want to be in meetings that involve planting a tree and discussing about certain policies. Why don't they have ideas about the national adaptation policy, for example? And after doing a research in my community, getting to understand why people are not in the climate conversation. And from the research that we did after playing the same documentary that we captured in Zambia, we got to realize that uh, the climate conversation has been put, the language has been put in a certain way that's not easy for people who are living in the informal settlements to understand. For example, people don't know what agreement was signed in Paris, but they want to know what's really happening. So it becomes a bit complicated for them to just get to understand and be part of the climate conversation because of how complicated the language has been put across. Then also, when you look at when it comes to climate finance, there's what certain people have heard people say, the middleman or something. So in a situation that there's a project, for example, in Zambia, in a community called George, you'll find that before maybe the funding reaches the actors on the ground, it has to go through this individual, this NGO, this. So by the time it's getting to the people, the climate actors on the ground, we discover that the resources are not enough for people to implement projects that they feel can work. It becomes difficult to just have a bottom-up approach and have climate actors on ground implement issues that affect them, because all the support and the resources that come to them come with conditions, how reports should be written, how monitoring and evaluation has to be done. It becomes hard for the climate actors on ground to implement projects that they feel fit them well. Thank you so much.
Thank you for that. And I think we definitely start seeing, um, I think that in the everyday basis, and especially as young people in the climate crisis, you're not allowed to access certain things. And if you do access certain things, now you've got to do A, B, C, this, that, and the third, jump through a hoop, a line of fire, and then maybe we will consider working with you or engaging you. It's like a means test to kind of stop people from engaging. I think your point, and I saw some people in the chat really like highlighting it, on the front of the way something is worded or the way that is produced and presented to people versus whether or not they can understand it are two different things. It's two different things, but the one solution being it needs to be accessible for people to engage it so that meaningful and fully informed participation can occur. And so when we talk about being left out of the room, when we talk about what are the systems that are underpinning the climate crisis, it's some of them are the fact that people aren't able to access funds, people aren't able to access opportunities, people aren't able to engage spaces because they're left out of the conversations. And being able to spin that narrative and actually flip it helps us begin to see how we can start transforming the way we engage with people. Joe, I think maybe I'll ask you the same question, but I want you to kind of answer it through the lens of what you mentioned earlier, through, uh, you know, what would your approach have been, or what would your answer have been, maybe, had you not figured out that maybe there needed to be a different approach? If it were just the political awareness element that you thought you originally had, or the public policy reform, not the physiology kind of, or like the deeper element that you added earlier. So, in your understanding, what are the systems that underpin the climate crisis from that approach that you mentioned earlier, where it needs to be more than one avenue? I suppose my question is kind of highlighting there, because I'm treating you as though you are two guests in my head, because you're coming at the answers with two answers. And so I'm wanting to treat you as though you are two guests in my head. So I'm questioning and I'm asking very difficult questions, but I hope you're able to kind of weave it in.
Okay. Can you hear me? I hope I'm audible.
Yes, we can. Loud and clear.
Okay. So I think a couple of things. I think we have to frame this conversation a bit differently. So I think the historical narrative around capitalism and what we're experiencing is really Western modernity and the pillars of Western modernity and how it was created. That was and a trajectory therein. When you're now locating climate change within this space, one realizes that it's just the next shiny racket to justify plunder. So because the logic of capitalism is primitive accumulation of capital, to paraphrase Karl Marx. So it means that as an economic system, the only way it can survive is by constantly, rapidly expanding and plundering everything around it. So I mean, by virtue of that, you've cut down all the trees, the oil industry, your crony capitalism in Africa and developing South, and you have that. So because of that, now you need, it's the crisis of how far do you go? Because capitalism as system is is this vampire that is constantly needs to eat, constantly needs to eat. So it creates an internal contradiction within its own system, such that it no longer, there's nothing else it can eat. So what to do with custodians? Do we say, okay, now the thing we have to do is now create some kind of climate change narrative? I mean, and this is not to say that there's no climate change, in terms of in terms of the narrative is how do you rectify this? You're trying to rectify capitalism with sanitized capitalism. So it becomes an oxymoron, but it becomes also foolhardy and foolish around this. So you say, for instance, renewable energies, for instance, wow, one of the things, but they don't talk about that many of the resources that are going towards renewable energies are coming from plunder from the Congo, for instance. It's this self vampire kind of system that is constantly trying to eat itself from within. So it's trying to save itself from within, saving capitalism from within. So I think once we recognize we can't save it from within, and to use the matrix analogy, is that this is empire. You can't be free within empire. So you have to get out of empire. So, and for me, my journey out of this, I don't think I'm out of it yet. My journey out of this conundrum had to go back to the pillars of how this thing was constructed. So, this is the first pillar which was constructed is theological. So, this is why when black people are killed, it's or victims. When the white person is killed, it's the global catastrophe. Is the idea of God. So it becomes a theological conversation, even before it becomes a climate change conversation, is the idea of God. We have to reconstruct that white God and demystify it to the extent we're going to now create it. It's a mythology. It's a mythology as a narrative of being that we have to first construct. The crisis, in my view, of decolonization without going this direction is that whereas if epistemic reconstitution, whereby giving people the knowledge is good, it has to be a conversation whereby how do you reconstruct human beings? And in this case, not just people from what we call the global south who have been under imperialism, but also people from the global north. W. Du Bois talks about this in both his essays, Souls of White Folk and the Souls of Black Folk, talking about what happens to the psyche because of this very antagonistic relationship between blackness and whiteness coming together and everybody else in between. It's not just black, but everywhere in between. So it's a reconstruction of the human. So for me, my conviction around even climate change, it has to be from within. My conviction is that there's a verse that is in the Bible that we talked about. I think Romans 8:20. It says, "Creation waits in expectation for the sons of men to be revealed." It actually says creation is groaning. So when I read that verse now as a liberal theologian, to my mind, but now I understand it as saying that this has to be we have to go through. We need a human project even before we can go to the climate change project. That our crisis that we have vampires. To use that word, I hope I'm not scaring anybody, but we're trying to reform the matrix from within. If even the movie The Matrix, Neo was freeing people out of the matrix, not trying to reform the matrix from within. So this is the contradiction of the climate change racket, because this is what actually it is. It's a racket. So we're talking about. In Kenya, our president is all over country planting trees. And don't get me wrong, I think there's an importance of planting trees, but to the extent of remedying the effects of capitalism can't fix capitalism, because the climate change crisis is an effect of ravenous capitalism, is an extractive logic. It's a vampire system. It can't fix itself. So we are stuck within where it's the logic of the left, where the left is still critiquing empire from within empire. So it becomes a conversation of redistribution and not of freedom. So I think this is the climate change crisis that we are facing in terms of as a method of critique, and not to say that we do have a climate change crisis. Our crisis that our methods and strategies are still imbued within empire or capitalism, whatever you want to call it. So therefore we go for COP, as my colleague has said, you go for COP27, and it becomes hilarious. It becomes hilarious. So there's all this big talk, but there's all this big talk from countries, etc. but they know even the few steps about reducing emissions. What does it mean for the industrialists? What does it mean for the people who lobbied them into those positions of power? What does it mean, for instance, if for instance during Trump, one of his biggest funders was the oil industry. So I'm not surprised that Trump said the climate change is a hoax. I mean, his biggest funders were, the oil and coal industry. So I think, and I think in particular now, especially in countries away from the West, I think that there's a certain level of genuineness we need to have to start realizing that some of these systems can be critiqued from within them. That we just become part of the treadmill, or become part of the treadmill, or where it is, then we learn into this vibe of wokeness. And to finish my last Olefumi Taiwo Jr. wrote a book, Elite Capture, how energy politics was captured by global capital. And he articulates and says we have to be careful about struggles that are not even viewed as the lived experience of the people, and don't have an accurate critique of empire, but also don't have an accurate way out of empire. So it easily gets stuck in that space.
Thank you so much for that, Joe. I think, firstly, I love the way that you've made it such an accessible conversation by bringing us into that good analogy of the Matrix. Neo did not bring people in. He was trying to get them out. It wasn't trying to fix the system. It was trying to overthrow the system. It was trying to move out of the existing system. And this idea that we can fix something that was never meant to help people, it's a contradiction in its own. And I think when we talk about capitalism and now to a further extent neoliberalism, we start looking at neoliberalism in my feeling is actually what we start seeing when we start seeing people start saying, oh, we fixed the things, this is now where we find ourselves. And now we sit with neoliberalism and people are sitting idly by believing that we've transformed radically. No, we've just moved from like when someone holds up, well, technically it's not dark red, but it's still red, but it's not dark red. So like we're good, we fix things. No, we're supposed to be in the dark green, the good side of where we are. Shifting an inch doesn't mean you've made change, doesn't mean you've moved anywhere. And so I love this point that you brought home to us now, which is just centering our conversation in actually, when we talk about strategies of transforming systems, we need to acknowledge the fact that transforming means moving from one thing to another thing, and in this case, unrecognizable. It mustn't be from capitalism to capitalism light. It must be from capitalism to liberation. It must be this complete transformation. Transformation, a caterpillar is not it does not become a butterfly because it does not transform. It becomes a butterfly because it goes through radical transformation. And unfortunately, I believe maybe we need to move from caterpillar to bird, maybe, because a caterpillar to a butterfly, it's still the same thing to its core. So maybe complete overall. So thanks for the points that you've raised there. And I mean, Nico, maybe I want to add to your point, and maybe you could touch on anything that Joe's mentioned. But the question I have for you is, through the work that you're doing and the activism, and I mean, you've mentioned it somewhat already. How do you believe, I mean, building onto the conversation that's continuing, how do you believe that we can begin to transform these systems, hold the perpetrators, or rather, the beneficiaries or the perpetrators to account within the system? I mean, obviously, as we begin transformation, as we begin radical kind of transformation out of the current systems that we find ourselves in, what are the ways and what are the avenues that you believe we as people can begin to hold those accountable at the same time? Because I believe, we don't want this thing where we've moved with the same people. We've transformed, but now we've transformed and the same people and the same people who are benefiting are residing there. So my question to you is, how through your work or through the kind of lens that you've shared with us earlier, building on the conversation and the additions that Joe's added, do you believe that we should begin holding the perpetrators or the beneficiaries of the current system to account?
Yeah, I think One thing I think I'll try by all means. I don't know if it's possible, so that in the comments section, I can share some of the poems and the videos that we have done, so that at least people can have quite a clear look on what I'm talking about. So the sad reality, unfortunately, so this poem that I feel I'm going to share in the link is pretty much talking about how most of the people, us as slum dwellers, our work is mostly in the slums. So most of the time, people depend on politicians for survival. So when you talk about holding certain people accountable for their action, just look at what's happening in Kenya, whereby you just want maybe to disagree on decisions that are being made by civic leaders, but the feedback that people usually get, it becomes a bit complicated. For example, in Zambia, we have got different policies which are made on roundtable discussions. People are not engaged, and interfering in those decisions made, it becomes quite a bit complicated. In Zambia, just a week ago, we had a Vietnam man who wanted to buy about 6 million hectares of land, maybe to build industries and other other companies that they want to do their projects in. And if people just try to hold them accountable, or maybe try to disagree, others end up losing their lives. But some of the things we can do is coming together as young people. I think the voice becomes more strong when young people come together and have a specific objective, and just try by all means to advocate for issues that affect them. So I think we need to get to a point where uh, we can bring the conversation to the rawest stage possible, because most of the people that face the harsh impact of climate change are marginalized communities who obviously contribute less to the climate impact. So I think holding certain people accountable uh, is important, looking at how they contribute to maybe the greenhouse gases and stuff, by coming together and just having one voice in addressing some of these issues. Because if we have some kind of stratification where we have a certain group of people doing the advocacy and others just living, waiting upon God to come, it becomes a bit complicated to just achieve certain objectives and set certain goals. So as KYC TV, I think our approach has been to organize the communities and ensure that they have one voice in addressing a certain issue. I think in this COP Paris meet agreements and COP meetings, I think one thing has been civic leaders coming together, just try to assure everybody that attends and the nation at large on how much they will contribute in order to fix the damages that have been made, especially in the informal parts of the world. So I think we call upon just a lot of people, young people, being in organized groups so that they can have one voice. Because if people are organized, the impact is usually felt. So yeah.
Yeah, a big thanks then. I think I love the point that you're mentioning, and I want to tag Joe to see if he has any reflections on that point. But I think your point around movement building and movement building from the ground is so important, because I do believe that some of the biggest changes that we've seen in society is when people actually say, no, enough is enough. I mean, here in South Africa, this year it's 30 years of democracy. Um, and we are also in Youth Month in South Africa, where we commemorate the struggle of activists, young activists in 1976 who fought up against the current system. And so I just wanted to acknowledge that point around movement building, and maybe pose the question, Joe, do you believe that and you could frame it how you see fit within your kind of answer, But do you believe that that's enough? Or do you believe that we need to start seeing some accountability, some contribution, some reparation, so what responsibility do the perpetrators of our harm have in fixing the solution? Or do you believe that the movement building from the ground is enough to fix it and to move us out of the space?
That's a really good question, and I think it comes out of political baggage, right? Particularly the idea of reparations. So I think there's an argument for reparations for sure. I think within the movement, I think this should be a conversation around movement of movements. So not one movement, movement of movements. So one, I think, is that there's an argument for reparation, which is a good case of there's a book by the writer, case for reparations. I think there's an argument for reparations, particularly around uh, the, the, the people who emit more emissions, but also people who have abused the climate more to pay for it more. However, within the language of empire and colonialism and capitalism, is that to paraphrase Fanon, Fanon says that capitalism and colonialism at its very core has no rationale. It's only languages of violence. So the only way it can give in is by greater violence. So I think on one hand, there's a collection of reparations. I think it needs to be pushed quite. I don't think it's a one size fits all solution. I think there's space for that. But on the other hand, what I find useful, particularly where we are in the world today, whereas the case for pushing for reparation is really the case for world building, or what the Kenyan writer Ibn Walsh says, we need now to get into the process of world making. And this is less antagonistic for fighting back, which needs to be done. But this is now really more the case of then how then do we build our communities, and for me, where I'm at in my journey is that we need two things: we need communities of faith and communities of reason intertwined together. Why do I say communities of faith and reason together? I say communities of reason because you need thinking groups, pockets of thinking groups, thinking spaces, communities of people who are thinking together. However, as someone who has been a practitioner of this thing, I realized that without a metaphysic, people can't come. There isn't any reconstruction of being, or rather, to use it to phrase it lightly, is that what we experienced as a world for the last 500 years was a collapse of humanity. The philosopher Ramon Grossfleck, I don't say his name correctly, defines racism as the dehumanization of another race of people by a dehumanized race. Hmm? Hmm? So so we've been in a world of we've lived the last 100 years in a world where we have dehumanized ourselves. So in the space of becoming human, I don't think you can think your way into being a human. When doing that, you just be playing back into Western minds, and in particular Rene Descartes' dictum, I think therefore I am. So just playing back to a Western mind of how to become human. So I think we need new frames, and that's those new frames in my mind. I would say communities of faith, really new spiritual practices, whereby we have to rethink. So we have to rethink this thing not just through reason alone, but through faith as well. So building that into the movement of movements of how now we become human beings together. My own journey and where I'm at in this is really for me as Joe is really a reconstruction of the Christian faith, and I'm in a journey of rethinking it based on my own context, my own experience, but also based on what it was, not how it came to Africa with colonialism, but what it was from early African Christianity. So that's my own journey of thinking about these two things, and then now creating a world inward out rather than staying where I was for a long time, where I was at the forefront, pushing, and that needs to be done. I'm not negating that. We have to still push because again, violence doesn't. I mean, you still have to counter violence with violence. But I'm just saying it has to be more strategic. So it has to be a world-making agenda where you have an army, but at the same time you also have the scholars and the librarians. So for a long time as a scholar, I've been in the army, but I also need to realize that I also have to also be a scholar as guys are fighting to build a new world. I don't know if I'm using too many analogies. I'm trying to
No,
make it make
it's
sense.
good.
Yeah, to make it make sense. So this is some of stuff I think about, particularly around food systems that I've written about. How do you build a more robust, resilient food systems within Kenya, within East Africa, which is my site of struggle.
Thanks for that, and I really appreciate the nuance you're bringing to the conversation. I definitely think. I mean, what I love I love a lot of what you've said now, but what really stuck out to me was near the end, where you just before you said, "I think I'm bringing too many analogies." You actually were right on the money with that last analogy around, the need that there needs to be the academic and the scholar and the person in the foreground fighting. And I think that's exactly why we're in this space, because I think for so long as well, part of the kind of the West's mission, or the kind of mission of capitalism, and we were speaking about it somewhat. Sorry for the noise in the background, but we were speaking about it somewhat on Monday. Is something that capitalism has done, has made people not want to engage the conversation around their economical and their political kind of standing in the space, because it uses words, and we've heard we heard Abednego mention it earlier. Big words are being used, things are being said, and you're left out of the conversation. And then you don't know what you're fighting for and if you should be fighting. And so bringing into that foreground the person fighting in the foreground, but also the importance of having the academic and the scholar standing together united, so that the fight can be informed with a strategy that is also informed. And it's kind of this continuous cycle of strategy and thought informed by experience and tactics on the ground, but tactics and experience on the ground informed by the research, the knowledge building, and more. And I'm really appreciating the conversation that we're having right now. Abednego, maybe the point I want to bring to you, and guys, after we hear from Abednego now, we're going to open up for a few questions. So if you have any questions, start thinking about them, popping them in the chat, get ready to raise your hand. Is just also further into that point of, do you maybe have any thoughts surrounding what sort of responsibility the West and other bodies of colonial legacy have in addressing the different crises that we find ourselves in, particularly the climate crisis? And it doesn't have to be a deep think piece. It can be whatever it may be, but I also welcome a deep think piece right now. Um, but yeah, just I think my question to its core just being, do you believe that there's a responsibility from the West and other bodies of colonial legacy? And if so, what does that look like in addressing the climate crisis?
Okay, thank you so much. I think some of the countries from the West, looking at the contribution that they have to the climate impacts, I think there are some certain people that need to spearhead the climate advocacy, to spearhead the climate conversations around the world. Because even looking at some of the contributions that they contribute to these to the pledges that they make, though I'm not really sure if those pledges are fulfilled or not, but they usually pledge quite huge sums of money because of the contributions that they have. So I think for me and the people from the informal settlement, I think some of the people from the West need to spearhead the conversation to help some of the countries that are just rising up from the impact. When I look at Zambia, for example, we didn't have enough rainfall this year, and we depend on maize as for our daily life, and we were unable to cultivate, meaning we are in a disaster. And when we don't have other people to come on board to just help and see to it that a country such as Zambia is able to recover, I think we'll end up in a disaster. So from the West, I think they need to spearhead some of the advocacy and to support certain countries that are recovering from the harsh impacts of climate around the world.
Thanks for that. And maybe before we open for questions, I just want to deepen the question a little bit more on what you've said. Do you truly believe that, or maybe not truly, but do you believe that there's a world possible where following them spearheading, they actually help liberate, or is it just them spearheading? You know, are we truly free from the systemic injustice or the systemic space that we find ourselves in, the system that we find ourselves in, if we are led by those who put us in the situation? So if you are led out of the forest by the person that had you get lost in the forest, do you think that we will find our way out? That's my question.
Yeah. I think where I was heading, for example, let me talk of maybe a certain government from the West is having a project on climate justice. When it's brought upon in a country such as, are you able to get me?
Now we can get you again. Can you start again? You said if they're bringing on a certain project?
It comes with its conditions, its terms, how it's supposed to work. But them spearheading doesn't necessarily mean them doing what should happen. So them being in the forefront just to facilitate on the resources based on their industrialization that have been developed, and looking at the amount of damage that is being caused around the world, they need to have quite a huge sum to contribute in helping other countries to recover. But them being in the forefront doesn't mean them are being the decision makers. Because even people from the marginalized communities and informal settlements knows the problems that they're going through, and they have the solution to their problems. But it becomes difficult because of resources just to recover in terms of impacts that really affect them.
Yeah. Okay, cool. I think I'm glad I asked you that second part of the question because I really think it added a depth to your answer that I appreciate. It's kind of navigating this way of whilst we are busy reforming, whilst we are busy transforming, moving out of the current system, it's how do we still make sure that we are getting our daily bread and also navigating the world. I mean, an analogy we talk about sometimes at ACA is this idea of a food garden. Weeds growing in between the food garden. Systemic change doesn't look like getting rid of the whole bed of food and vegetables because now no one will eat. So it looks like going deep into the ground and uprooting the roots, taking our time, but also being clear with the time that it takes to remove it, because taking too long and your vegetables will be affected and your people will be affected. But you do need to go into the ground, pull out those weeds so that the flower bed can be good and healthy, that the garden can be good and healthy, it can reap the rewards. And so it's finding that weird middle ground of surviving in the current system whilst still calling for an overthrow of it and a deep, resilient transformation. So before we kind of, I'm noticing time when I'm looking at it, and I did promise a Q&A. And so I just want to pause for a moment and just check, does anybody have a question for either of our panelists? And this is just me opening the floor. And if you don't, that's completely fine. Sometimes you just sit there and you're like, oh, this is a good conversation, cup of tea. But I think I would like to challenge you, and your question doesn't have to be something, like academic. It can be something simple about what's going on the ground. Both of these individuals, both Joe and Abednego, are good at what they're doing, guys. You're seeing it in live time. They can help answer those questions. So do you have any questions you'd like to pose to either of them?
Gabe, so long. There was a
Yes,
comment in the chat box, so I could be reading that so long.
that would be great.
Okay, cool,
Thanks.
cool. Um, Wayne is saying, so this was in response to, I think, the second question that Abednego was touching on about the accessibility of the language and the policies and the work that at times government, tries to do and implement. So Wayne is saying, I am worried about that, especially here in Zimbabwe. They are currently drafting the climate change management bill, and it looks like the people from rural areas whom I think are very much affected are not being included in the talks. Yes, we commend them for trying to include everyone, but what are the efforts being made for this demographic to understand and contribute?
Mm. I think even
So
within
what's
there,
the
there's a question. So
yeah,
yeah, I think, and maybe Tulu, you could help me frame it, but I think the question there is is actually uh, can decisions, can policy to help call for change actually be done without those most affected involved in its formation?
yeah. And I think also just generally we do see that with people in general, there's almost a reluctance to participate. So not only just them being able to access, the resources, but there's also a reluctance to participate. And there's different issues that, contribute in that regard. It could be things like police brutality or just generally feeling like there is no point in me participating in any way because I will not be heard. So how do we also, try and weed that out and try and bring people into the fold and make them realize that their voices do matter in these kinds of issues?
Yeah, maybe
Mm.
can I
Go
go
for
in
it.
there? Okay, so I think just an addition, something that we are doing as the New York City TV and Slum Dwellers International is how do we ensure that those policies are brought to visual. For example, when you look at the climate adaptation policy that we have in the state, this is a document of about 25 pages. It looks like a novel, but how does that document look like from an ordinary Zambian who stays in the informal settlement? So it all comes back to, since we cannot be part of the roundtable discussions where those policies are being made, but at least how do we ensure that those policies are people from the informal settlement are able to understand and also just give their opinion and objectives about whatever that is being implemented uh, by the by the civic leaders. Because when you look at our way of life in Africa, politicians have a certain level of power, despite the people putting them in that position. They tend to be the people who now they become the king after winning an election. And every decision that is made by them, if it's something that fits them, they feel it's okay and it's something that fits everybody. Let's look at maybe the housing policy that we have. This is a policy that ensures a certain individual has to build their house in a certain way. But let's go back to when this policy was brought to life. Who came up with this policy? Did they come up with this policy based on what fits them? Or maybe they had to engage the people just to get to understand, is this okay for this person who gets this income maybe per month, they make $1 per month, and they fit in this policy. So I think it all comes back to how do we simplify some of the policies that are being made maybe by the government and others that are brought on us by the Western. How do we ensure that each and everybody is able to understand and also give an opinion without being scared? I think politicians, most of the time, they tend to say freedom of expression, but in the actual sense, there's no freedom after expression. So it goes back for young people and everybody, more especially the people that face the direct impact of this climate, to just uh, advocate and ensure that they understand whatever that is being posed upon them.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think I want to add more because I don't want to dilute any of your words. And maybe I'll tag Joe in to see if there's any additions to what you've said, but I definitely truly do agree on that point. Before tagging you in, Joe, Tulu, I see your hand up.
You see this dream team we're talking about, because I also was about to just tag Joe in. Because I am thinking like very often, when it comes to Western countries or, colonial powers that used to be, I like to think, um, often when they, put in some kind of effort into the continent, some sort of financial relief, even these financial institutions like your World Bank, your International Monetary Fund, often you find that it is a trap, to further colonize African nations. So when we are asking, for them to take responsibility for the contributions that they have had to the climate crisis, and in particular how it affects the continent. So how do we sort of do that without, falling into that trap, or without entrapping ourselves, where we have been given these sort of aids and injections by these, institutions in these countries, and now we end up in a situation where we are being colonized again, because this is something that you're seeing itself this is something that you see play itself out in a lot of countries across the continent, where European nations come in under the guise of aid and helping out. And in actual fact, they just gain more and more, political hold and political control. And particular, they grab hold of our economic systems so much so that we seem to not be able to do anything without them.
Yeah, and I just want to, like, my last little sprinkling before I tag you in, Joe, is a word that I recently had in a conversation with Asad Rehman, a well-known activist, a part of the Climate Justice Coalition in the UK. He said that, and I want to just see what your thoughts are on it, is that one of the many new forms of colonialism from the West or from colonial powers to Africa is through debt and through the debt trap. And I'm curious to know, just adding that point there, if there's any truth to it, do you believe? So my question, you can somewhat answer a little bit to that first question, then also to what Kulu's mentioned now.
Okay, thanks for that. Really, thanks. Really, very good questions. I like them. I mean, so it's clear. I mean, Thomas Sankara in 1968 said, I mean, I talked about two things which are really linked towards this conversation. One, he talked about how debt is an instrument of colonialism, and he saw that in properly after the Washington Consensus, and then what came to Africa in particular, in what we call the SAPs, programs. From in Kenya, it was in 1985. That's when we signed the first. We signed in 1980, but we went to the first IMF program in 1985, all the way to 1999. So 15 years, we lost a decade. And then with government debt to collapse, so our society collapsed literally overnight. Our government services, education, health. This was how neoliberalism, which you've talked about, came into now Kenya with all this whole the privatization craze of privatizing of public goods, health, education, social services, etc. And this is what in fact Kenyans are actually fighting right now as we speak on the streets. Of course, we're fighting our current government, but the hand behind the hand is actually the IMF, and which is a better known institution, which is again the previous regime was fed so much debt, both by Chinese debt and European American debt, that now it's a way of enslaving Africans, because this is the mark of the 2008 financial crisis, where now you need to create a crisis. It's how capitalism survives. So you offload the dollar into the dollar value through debt. That's what we're witnessing. That's what we are seeing. Tied to the previous question, out of debt, with the previous question again. I'm not saying that policy is not important. What I'm saying is that 61 plus years of independence for very many African countries, we have to start beginning to ask the more fundamental questions whether these colonial states are fit for purpose. So I think for me, policy is a stopgap measure to just because at the very core of it, you need to survive empire. So that's a really a stopgap measure. But at the long haul, at the long duration of history, I don't think policy is useful. I think what's useful is creating, imagining our existence, and to live in a way that recognizing that the empire around us, we have to be, in a sense, anarchists, but towards building a kind of imaginary away from uh, away from modernity. So away from, in particular, when I mean modernity in this context, I mean away from the bourgeoisie idea of middle class, which is it's a class of death, and then two, away also from the state. And of course, for Africans, it's a colonial state. For it's the Westphalian idea of the state is not useful. When you start thinking of other political and social units to exist in, I mean, Russia, Turkey, Brazil, China, they are talking about the civilization state as a different kind of political unit. Uh, for us to go, particularly because this is my strongest conviction, for us to go particularly to circumvent, but also to deal with the challenges of climate change, we have to not just tear the colonial borders, which is one step. We're talking about AU, African Union unity is a good step, but we also have to think of not smaller units, but more uh, mid-sized units within the African unity of new political formations, new political. So we have to even give this new language that won't be talking about states or countries, but we'll be thinking about something totally different, uh, because that's the only way we can move away from what's happening, the crash that's coming, the crash that's coming. If you look at as the imperium is collapsing, empire is collapsing, therefore because of imperial overstretch, uh, increasingly the current context there, therefore when you can see 4 points of convergence that are happening. The first convergence is in Haiti, second one is in Gaza, third one is in Ukraine, and the fourth one is in Kenya. What's happening right now in Kenya? And they all mean something towards this conversation. The conversation on Haiti was a liberation struggle. So in terms of, so there's a scourge. It's a scourge within empire, within European, within the imagination of the West. I mean, because it was, I mean, they pushed back and they became the first free black state. So there's something about that because it counters the idea, the hegemony, the idea that they could be one. It counters the hegemony. So there's something towards the white imagination that scares them. The second one is Gaza, in particular Israel. The conversation of America and the West as manifest destiny, its legitimacy comes from sustaining Israel as a state. Where there's a conversations around Israel, even theological conversations around Israel as it's a space where Israel was given land by God, or at least the Judeo-Christian God. That's a different conversation from what we're having. The conversation that we need to be having is that America derives its godlike status from the idea of manifest destiny, and this status comes from it settling the Israeli, it being conjoined with the Israel state, which is an apartheid state, right? Levitical laws that they should subscribe to, according to the Torah. So we have to first, there are many things you have to question them, the whitewashing of it. So the whitewashing of the state, or whitewashing of what it exists for, it goes against everything that the Torah, even if they were to frame the argument and saying that they have a Torah, they have some divine rule based on their Judeo-Russian. It's something, capitalism, I said earlier. has to keep on expanding. Ukraine is the last bastion of Western Europe that has resources, oil, and stuff, and it's something about encompassing that whole imagination. And the fourth one is Kenya. Kenya, as Frantz Fanon said, was even in the post-African Revolution, that Kenya was a perfect colony. It's not by surprise that we are sending policemen to Haiti to go kill our African brothers. So even as we are, so these four convergent points are located should be points of discussions, even as we're talking about the climate crisis. Because increasingly, friends, the more I think about it, the more I reflect about these issues, if we don't accelerate the level of imagination, we're going to collapse with the empire, because it's collapsing. Imperial overstretch has come about, it's collapsing. So we have to, and because it will collapse painfully, not just for level of politics and economics, but for us, which is very important in Africa, ecologically. So we have to start aggressively thinking about these ecological practices and theory making very, very aggressively, away from the conversations for how do these things look like in practice. And then, so the conversation is really not about, it's not policy, it's not innovation chasing policy, but it's policy chasing innovation. Now the level of policy. So many of our conversations are happening for, let's go to COP27, and it's good, and I'm not saying they're bad, but where we need to be is let's innovate, and then policy chases, and then innovation, the policy chases the innovation. So now once we have the communities of practice, the communities of reason, how we are building together at scale is when now we can now go and push policy. Because if we just play a policy game, we are playing into the usual racket that we have been in the post-independence era, where we're constantly negotiating with people whose power has been derived from subjecting these systems to the rest of the world. I don't know historically any place that has ever happened where a bad guy has said, okay, now I have seen my way of my sins, and now let's come and let's hug and let's get together. This is in movies. We don't see this stuff in movies. Why are we trying to create this thing in real life? The narrative in movies is that the good guy kills the bad guy, and then is the hero walking. So I'm not advocating for killing, but what an analogy is that your oppressors can't be the ones who give you freedom.
Wow. Yeah, I think this is definitely a dialogue that I'm going to be listening back to, and internalizing. I think the conversation between both yourself, Joe, and you, Abednego, has been such a rich one today, and we are coming to the end of our dialogue. And I know there's questions in the chat, but we will capture them. We will send them to our amazing panelists today, and we'll get you your answers. Perhaps your answers will be answered in the wrap post that you will see on social media in the coming weeks. But maybe just in the form of closing, maybe starting with you, Abednego, just do you have any last words that you'd like to kind of embark onto us, that you part into the space here before we end? I think it would be remiss of me after such a deep conversation to just say, well, that was the evening. I think if there's any last words in 2 minutes or 1 minute, let's say, that you'd like to kind of share with the rest of the space before we come to a close, and then I'll do the same with you, Joe. Abednego, go for it.
Hello. It has been quite a great discussion, and I think my last words as young people, let's take keen interest in getting to understand maybe the policies that are being brought on us, and maybe the project, because some of the projects usually look good, more especially when we see some money, but let's get to understand, to say, why is this coming? And is it a bet? What are we giving out in return? So that at the end of the day, we are able to address some of the climate issues in a critical way and in a constructive way. So I think young people, we need to get together, support each other, and ensure that even the hard to reach are part of the climate conversation, because the number of people attempt to be ignorant and not so interested in the climate conversation, but in the actual sense, it's just very difficult for them to just get to understand in which part of the climate fight do they fit. So let's just take interest in getting to understand and being part of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And yeah, we are absolutely honored to have you here this evening and hear your words. And I believe you've come from an angle of let's approach the conversation. How do we get those who aren't involved? And beyond that, how do we deepen their voices, their opinions, their positions, their experiences in the way that conversations are being had around our system and transforming our system? And Joe, I think some of the reflection I'm hearing from you today is beyond that. Now they're involved. How do we toss the conversation out the window? How do we? I saw it on social media. I forget her name, a First Nations woman from the USA, who said, "Forget bringing me to the table. Decolonial work is chopping the table up and turning it into firewood so that we may have a conversation in another way." And I believe we're beginning to see some of that rhetoric coming from you today. So, in 1 minute, maybe what is your last parting words to the group?
No, I mean, I think it's a step in the right direction, but we need to be much more practical. The crisis, and I have to admit, because I've been also part of the thing, is that a lot of the work that we're able to do is being funded not from within ourselves. So I think there's you're running an NGO, so you're boxed within the same matrix that you're trying to get off from. But I think even as we do that, it has to be strategic, knowing that a lot of the key work won't happen within those spaces. Is that also recognizing that if you recognize that you're an empire, you have to recognize that you're at war with the empire. It means you have to be strategic and clever how you're moving within it and can create a different world outside of it. I think that's my conclusion. I think yes. I think because we don't get caught up in this shiny thing called climate change. We can another quite part of the way in which how this empire it survives is by the long play on narratives and stories. So you waste a whole you wasted. I'm from the generation we call millennial. I'm a mid to younger millennial. We wasted my 20s fighting each other on identity politics, and whereas we were supposed to create an inclusive society, it became the bane of our separation amongst ourselves and my peers. And if you look at social media on Twitter, men were in one corner, women in another corner, everybody else is in their corner doing stuff, and yet the violence that comes from us from the real hard stuff we're not going against. So we need to be careful about these diversionary tactics and realize that we need not to be how do we remain concerted and organized. This is how this thing is going. How do you play? How do you make sure that the destination has not been waylaid? Tominyolo says something in his book, Darker Side of Modernity, saying that we all have to negotiate within what he calls the colonial matrix of power, because we're constantly making decisions based on where we are in it. So once we recognize that you're constantly making decisions within it, and it's a game of survival, the outlook and what you desire as a community, particularly ecological justice, whatever you guys desire, once you move into that goal, there's a pursuit, there's a oneness, there's a unity, there's a clear objective towards what you want to achieve.
A massive thank you for that. And I think there's definitely, entire conversations that we can have around it, and how we can begin to frame and reframe other conversations I mean, when we talk about deep systemic change, and this is just in the broad sense, and I think we're also humbled and honored to have had you here as well, Joe, to kind of add the deeper nuance that you've added to the conversation that we didn't think we might have been going into tonight. But we are grateful for the depth in which we've gone, because I truly believe that when we talk about the reform that we need to make, and the transformation that we need to make, your points around not being idle in a system that does not serve us, not being caught up by the distractions that are being thrown our way, also coming forward, and the point that you highlighted there being very essential. And then to a further extent, also just highlighting, cool, maybe these are the distractions that people have so that they do not feel overwhelmed by the broader conversation of deep systemic change. So actually, then how do we change the rhetoric of these approachable topics when we talk about the deep systemic change that needs to happen, the revolutionary change that needs to happen, not the deep systemic change, but the revolutionary change, the transformation that needs to happen? How do we reframe the entry points that people already have in this space? But yeah, I think this evening we've just touched on it, and there's more to come in the future. Your questions have been noted in the comments, everybody. We will make sure that those are answered, sent forward. The beauty of Zoom is that we are able to capture the chat after the recording, and so we'll make sure to send that forward. But that's been the evening of discussion. Once again, a massive thank you to yourself, Abednego, and to you, Joe, our amazing panelists for this evening's conversation on empowering change, looking at strategies for transforming systems in the face of the climate crisis, and beyond that, understanding the deeper systemic injustice and crises that we face. A massive thank you to everyone who's been here and engaged in this space, and listened into the conversation. I think your contributions and your additions in the comment section, but also your contribution and your addition of being in the space has helped us realize that this is 53 more people more than an hour and a half ago that knew about the topic in the depth that we've had it today. And so a massive thank you for that, and just I wish you all an amazing evening going forward.